The Remains of the Day Summary. Stevens, Miss Kenton, Lord Darlington, and the Cost of Duty. Dignity, regret, love, loyalty, and self-deception. The Remains of the Day is a 1989 literary novel by Kazuo Ishiguro, published by Faber and Faber and named winner of the 1989 Booker Prize. The novel is historical literary fiction, but it is not historical fiction in the simple costume drama sense. Its real subject is memory under pressure, what a man tells himself after a life built on loyalty, restraint, and professional pride begins to look morally compromised. The big idea of the book. The big idea of The Remains of the Day is that dignity can become a prison when it is detached from moral judgment, emotional honesty, and personal responsibility. Stevens believes he has lived honorably because he served a great household with discipline. He believes greatness lies in subordinating the self to a worthy employer. He believes a butler achieves dignity by suppressing private feeling and performing flawlessly, especially under strain. The novel tests that belief from every angle. What if the master was not truly great? What if professional excellence helped sustain political corruption? What if emotional restraint was not strength, but fear? What if a life of perfect service was also a life of evasion? The story is devastating because Stevens is not stupid, cruel, or obviously corrupt. He is competent, controlled, sincere, and often funny without meaning to be. His tragedy is not that he never had values. It is that he borrowed someone else's values and called them his own. The story, in one flow. The novel begins in 1956 at Darlington Hall, once one of England's great aristocratic houses. Stevens, the long-serving butler, now works for Mr. Faraday, an American who has bought the estate after the decline of its former owner, Lord Darlington. Mr. Faraday is informal, teasing, and modern, in a way Stevens finds difficult to interpret. He jokes with Stevens and expects a kind of light verbal play that Stevens calls bantering. Stevens, whose entire life has been governed by formal service, treats banter almost as a professional skill to be studied and mastered. A practical issue gives the novel its outward plot. Darlington Hall is understaffed. Stevens has received a letter from Miss Kenton, the former housekeeper, now Mrs. Ben, who once worked with him during the household's most important years. Stevens reads the letter as possibly suggesting unhappiness in her marriage, and, more usefully to him, as a sign that she may wish to return to service. Mr. Faraday encourages Stevens to take a motoring trip while he is away. Stevens accepts, partly to visit Miss Kenton in Cornwall, and partly to see more of the country he has spent his life serving from indoors. That journey becomes the frame for the novel. Stevens drives through England, while remembering Darlington Hall in the 1920s and 1930s. At first, Stevens presents the trip as professional. He is not chasing love, regret, or confession. He is merely assessing whether a former colleague might help solve a staffing problem. That distance matters. Stevens repeatedly uses practical language to avoid emotional language. He can discuss silver polish, staff plans, and professional standards more easily than disappointment, desire, shame, or loneliness. As Stevens travels, the old world begins to reappear through memory. Darlington Hall, under Lord Darlington, was not just a large house. It was a political meeting place where aristocrats, diplomats, and influential figures gathered between the wars. Stevens sees this as proof that he served at the center of history. By serving Lord Darlington, he believes, he indirectly served civilization. The early memories establish Stevens's professional creed. He believes the finest butlers possess dignity, by which he means composure under pressure, loyalty to the household, and the ability to disappear into the role. A great butler does not collapse into personal emotion. He does not question his employer publicly. He does not allow private grief, attraction, irritation, or conscience to disrupt the smooth running of the house. Stevens's father, William Stevens, embodies this older servant ideal. He is also a butler, severe and emotionally closed, and Stevens admires him almost as a professional monument rather than a parent. When Stevens's father comes to work at Darlington Hall in old age, his decline becomes one of the novel's early wounds. William Stevens is no longer physically capable of the precision he once represented. He falls, makes mistakes, and becomes an inconvenience inside the very world that once measured his value by competence. Stevens responds with concern, but always through the language of duty. He treats his father's decline as a staffing and dignity problem, not as an emotional crisis. This matters because one of the novel's central tests arrives during a major international conference at Darlington Hall. Lord Darlington hosts European guests in an attempt to influence the post-First World War settlement and soften attitudes toward Germany. Stevens is responsible for the smooth running of the event. During the conference, Stevens's father is dying upstairs. Stevens continues working. He checks arrangements, manages staff, maintains service, and suppresses the full force of what is happening. When his father dies, Stevens remains committed to the professional demands of the evening. To Stevens, this proves dignity. He has not failed his post. He has performed under maximum private strain. In his own account, this is almost a badge of greatness. To the reader, the scene is horrifying in a quieter way. Stevens has been trained to believe that refusing grief is noble. His father dies almost inside the machinery of service, and Stevens converts the event into evidence of professional success. Ishiguro lets the emotional damage reveal itself through Stevens's restraint, rather than through melodrama. Miss Kenton enters the story as the person most capable of disrupting Stevens's sealed world. She is intelligent, energetic, observant, and emotionally direct. As housekeeper, she works beside Stevens, managing the female staff and maintaining the domestic order of Darlington Hall. Their relationship begins in conflict. Miss Kenton challenges Stevens's management, criticizes his father's reduced abilities, and refuses to accept Stevens's evasions. Stevens finds her irritating because she sees what he is trying not to see. She notices weakness, emotion, injustice, and absurdity. She presses where he withdraws. Over time, their professional friction becomes intimacy, though Stevens cannot name it as such. They meet in the evenings over cocoa to discuss household matters. These meetings become one of the emotional centers of the book. On the surface, they are administrative. Underneath, they are the closest thing Stevens has to companionship. Miss Kenton repeatedly tries to reach him as a person, rather than merely as a butler. She brings flowers to his pantry to soften the room. Stevens objects because the room is a professional space. She notices him reading sentimental romances and teases him gently. Stevens insists he reads them only to improve his English. She tries to create warmth. He translates warmth into procedure. The tragedy of their relationship lies in this constant mistranslation. Miss Kenton speaks in gestures, tests, invitations, and emotional challenges. Stevens replies with rules, deflections, and professional terminology. He is not indifferent. He is afraid of what emotion would require him to admit. Meanwhile, Lord Darlington's political world becomes more troubling. He is presented as a well-meaning aristocrat, burdened by guilt over the Treaty of Versailles, and sympathetic to Germany's suffering after the First World War. Stevens sees him as honorable, generous, and historically important. But Lord Darlington's sympathy drifts into dangerous political naivety. He becomes associated with appeasement, pro-German circles, and anti-Semitic influence. The novel does not make him a cartoon villain. That is part of its intelligence. Darlington is not portrayed as a secret mastermind. He is weak, vain, class-bound, and vulnerable to manipulation by people who understand how to flatter his sense of importance. The moral crisis becomes unavoidable when Lord Darlington orders the dismissal of 2 Jewish maids from Darlington Hall. Stevens carries out the instruction. Miss Kenton is appalled. She threatens to resign if the dismissals happen. Stevens does not openly defend the maids. He hides behind the logic of service. The employer has decided, and the servants must obey. Miss Kenton does not resign. This failure haunts her too. Later, she admits that she was ashamed of herself for staying. The moment is crucial because Ishiguro refuses to place all moral weakness in Stevens alone. Miss Kenton sees more clearly than Stevens, but she also compromises. She feels the wrongness and still remains inside the system. For Stevens, the dismissals are one of the great cracks in his life story. He later tries to manage the memory by saying Lord Darlington eventually regretted the decision and tried to make amends. But the fact remains, Stevens participated. His professional loyalty helped convert prejudice into action. The novel's political strand deepens through Darlington's gatherings. The great house becomes a stage for amateur diplomacy, upper-class influence, and the illusion that gentlemen can settle the fate of nations through private conversation. Stevens is proud to be near these events, but his pride depends on not judging them. His idea of service requires trust in the master. A butler, in Stevens's view, cannot constantly question the moral and political decisions of the person he serves. He must attach himself to a great man and perform his own role well. The novel's central moral problem is hidden there. Stevens has outsourced conscience upward. During the 1956 journey, Stevens meets ordinary people outside the closed world of Darlington Hall. These encounters expose the limitations of his worldview. In one village, locals mistake him for a gentleman because of his speech and bearing. They discuss dignity, democracy, and political responsibility in terms very different from Stevens's. One man, Harry Smith, argues that dignity is not about polished restraint or service to superiors. It is about ordinary people having the right to think, speak, vote, and hold opinions. This unsettles Stevens because it challenges the hierarchy on which his identity rests. If dignity belongs to everyone, not just to those who serve greatness with composure, then Stevens's whole professional religion shrinks. These travel scenes widen the novel. Stevens has spent his life in rooms where power is filtered through class. Outside Darlington Hall, he encounters people who see politics not as the business of great men, but as something that affects every citizen. He is courteous to them, but he cannot fully absorb what they represent. The road trip also reveals how physically and historically out of place Stevens has become. England has changed. The aristocratic world has weakened. Darlington Hall itself is no longer the center of influence it once seemed to be. Mr. Faraday's ownership signals a new order: American money, informality, tourism, and the conversion of Old English prestige into something almost decorative. Stevens, however, continues trying to preserve the old code. Even when the world that produced him has faded, he remains loyal to its manners. That is one of the novel's sharpest cruelties. Stevens is not merely trapped by a living system. He is trapped by a system already dying. As the memories move closer to the emotional center, Miss Kenton's life begins to shift. She receives attention from Mr. Ben, a man outside Darlington Hall, who offers the possibility of marriage and a different life. Stevens notices, but he refuses to respond as a man who might lose someone he loves. Miss Kenton gives him chances. She tells him about Mr. Ben. She creates situations where he could object, confess, ask her to stay, or at least admit that her departure would matter. Stevens retreats into professional language. He discusses staffing implications. He avoids the personal claim. One of the most painful scenes occurs when Miss Kenton finds Stevens reading alone. She tries to see the book in his hands, teasing him with intimacy. The moment is charged because it is physically close, private, and playful. Stevens experiences it intensely, but his narration flattens it into embarrassment and propriety. He cannot admit desire without threatening the identity he has built. Miss Kenton eventually becomes engaged. Stevens responds by congratulating her in the correct tone. He does not fight for her. He does not ask whether she is happy. He does not admit that her leaving will injure him. Once again, he performs dignity at the exact moment when dignity requires courage rather than restraint. The night Miss Kenton is upset, Stevens chooses duty. Guests require service downstairs. His professional responsibilities continue. He does not go to her as a man. He remains a butler. The pattern established with his father repeats with Miss Kenton. When love asks something of him, he answers with work. Years later, on the 1956 journey, Stevens finally meets Miss Kenton, now Mrs. Benn, in Cornwall. This meeting is the destination the novel has been moving toward, though Stevens has disguised it as an employment errand. The meeting is polite, restrained, and quietly devastating. Miss Kenton is not simply waiting to be restored to Darlington Hall. She has had an unhappy marriage at times, and she admits there were moments when she wondered what life with Stevens might have been. But she has also chosen her life. She has a daughter. She expects to become a grandmother. She is returning to her husband. This is the emotional climax. The possibility Stevens may have carried, even if he refused to name it, closes. Miss Kenton gives him the truth with more honesty than he can easily bear. There was another life available, but it was not taken. It cannot now be recovered. Stevens's response is one of the great moments of controlled heartbreak in modern fiction. He admits, indirectly and briefly, that his heart is breaking. But even then, he does not collapse into confession. His language remains guarded. The reader sees the pain through the gap between what he feels and what he can say. After parting from Miss Kenton, Stevens sits on a pier at Weymouth as evening falls. He listens to strangers and reflects on the phrase, "the remains of the day." The title now carries its full meaning. It refers not only to the evening hours after work, but to what remains of a life after its central chances have passed. A stranger suggests that evenings can be the best part of the day. Stevens tries to take comfort from this. He decides he should return to Darlington Hall and improve his bantering skills for Mr. Faraday. On the surface, this looks like a modest, practical resolution. Underneath, it is ambiguous and painful. Has Stevens learned? Partly. He has allowed himself to see more than before. He has recognized Lord Darlington's failure more clearly. He has felt the loss of Miss Kenton. He has glimpsed the cost of his choices, but he also retreats into service. He does not overthrow his identity. He does not begin a radically new life. He adapts his old role to a new master. The ending is not redemption in the simple sense. It is a small adjustment after a catastrophic delay. The main characters inside the story. Stevens is the narrator, protagonist, and central mystery. He is a butler who has built his identity around discipline, dignity, and service. What he wants, consciously, is professional excellence. What he wants unconsciously is reassurance that his life has mattered. His fear is not merely emotion. His deeper fear is that emotion will reveal the emptiness or moral danger of the structure he has trusted. If he admits love, grief, anger, or doubt, then he must admit that he is more than a function. That would force him to judge the life he has spent avoiding judgment. Miss Kenton is the former housekeeper of Darlington Hall and Stevens's emotional counterpart. She is not free of compromise, but she is more alive to feeling and moral discomfort than Stevens. She challenges him because she wants truth from him, even when she disguises that desire as irritation. Her tragedy is that she waits too long for a man who cannot speak. She sees the possibility between them, tests it, and finally chooses another path. Unlike Stevens, she eventually lives outside Darlington Hall. That does not make her life perfect, but it makes it real in a way Stevens's life is not. Lord Darlington is the aristocratic master whose reputation shapes Stevens' memories. He wants to be a great gentleman involved in great affairs. His weakness is vanity disguised as conscience. He believes he is acting honorably, but he lacks the political judgment to see how easily decency can be manipulated by darker forces. Darlington matters because Stevens's whole moral defense depends on him. If Darlington was great, Stevens's service was meaningful. If Darlington was foolish or compromised, Stevens must face the possibility that his life's work served error. William Stevens, Stevens' father, represents the older ideal of service in its harshest form. He gives Stevens a model of dignity built on emotional suppression. His decline shows the cruelty of measuring human worth by usefulness. Once the body fails, the servant's identity begins to collapse. Mr. Faraday represents the post-war order. He is American, casual, and less invested in the old codes. He does not understand Stevens fully, but he owns the house that once symbolized English aristocratic power. His presence turns Darlington Hall into a relic. Mr. Ben, Miss Kenton's husband, is not developed as deeply as Stevens or Miss Kenton, but his role is decisive. He represents the ordinary life Stevens never chooses: marriage, frustration, family, compromise, departure, return, and continuity. He wins not because he is grander than Stevens, but because he is able to act. The moment everything changes. The decisive turn is not one event but a sequence: Miss Kenton's moral challenge over the dismissed Jewish maids, her later movement toward marriage, and Stevens' refusal to respond honestly. These moments expose the same failure in different forms. Politically, Stevens will not question Lord Darlington. Emotionally, he will not claim Miss Kenton. Personally, he will not admit grief or desire. His life turns on the belief that restraint is always superior to expression. The reader's understanding changes when it becomes clear that Stevens' dignity is not neutral. It has consequences. It protects prejudice. It abandons love. It converts fear into etiquette. It allows a man to feel virtuous, while avoiding the decisions that would make virtue meaningful. The ending explained. The ending brings Stevens and Miss Kenton together after many years, but it does not give them a late romance. Miss Kenton admits that she sometimes imagined a different life with Stevens, yet she is returning to her husband and family. The door Stevens never opened is now closed. Emotionally, the ending is about recognition without repair. Stevens sees the outline of what he lost, but recognition arrives too late to recover it. He cannot go back to the evenings over cocoa, the missed invitations, the private chances, or the moment when one honest sentence might have changed both lives. Morally, the ending is about responsibility. Stevens can no longer fully hide behind Lord Darlington. He admits that he trusted his lordship and gave his best to him. Lord Darlington at least made his own mistakes. Stevens' pain is that he may not even be able to claim that. He gave his life to another man's choices. The final movement to the pier matters, because Stevens is among ordinary people enjoying the evening. The day is nearly over, but not entirely. He decides to make the best of what remains by improving his banter and serving Mr. Faraday well. That decision is deliberately double-edged. It is touching because Stevens is trying to continue. It is tragic because he can still imagine the future, only as better service. Ishiguro does not humiliate him with a dramatic breakdown. He leaves him with a small, fragile self-deception that may also be a survival strategy. What the book is really about, The Remains of the Day, is about the danger of living through borrowed judgment. Stevens does not think of himself as political, but his refusal to judge politics is itself political. He does not think of himself as emotionally cowardly, but his refusal to speak becomes a choice with permanent consequences. He does not think of himself as morally evasive, but his loyalty gives practical support to Lord Darlington's errors. The book is also about class conditioning. Stevens' tragedy cannot be separated from the system that taught him to treat self-erasure as honor. He has internalized hierarchy so deeply that he experiences obedience as identity. He does not need chains because he has learned to polish them. Most painfully, the novel is about regret without theatricality. Stevens does not deliver a grand confession. He does not suddenly become modern, emotionally fluent, or politically radical. His tragedy is smaller and more believable. He sees enough to suffer, but perhaps not enough to transform. What most summaries miss. Many summaries describe The Remains of the Day as a story of repressed love between Stevens and Miss Kenton. That is true, but incomplete. The romance is inseparable from politics, class, and moral agency. Stevens loses Miss Kenton for the same reason he misjudges Lord Darlington. He refuses to act from his own inner authority. In love, he waits for professional language to protect him. In politics, he waits for his employer's status to absolve him. In family life, he waits for duty to excuse his emotional absence. Shallow readings also miss the novel's quiet comedy. Stevens is often unintentionally funny. His seriousness about banter, his elaborate self-justifications, and his inability to read obvious emotional signals create a dry comic surface. That comedy makes the tragedy sharper, because it shows how absurd and fragile his self-protection is. Another missed detail is Miss Kenton's imperfection. She is not simply the emotionally healthy alternative to Stevens. She sees more, but she also compromises. Her failure to resign over the Jewish maids matters, because the novel is not about one bad man and one good woman. It is about how systems survive, because many people make small accommodations with what they know is wrong. What most people misunderstand. The most common misunderstanding is that Stevens has no feelings. He has deep feelings. The problem is that he has trained himself to experience them as interruptions, embarrassments, or threats to professional order. Another misunderstanding is that the novel condemns service itself. It does not. Ishiguro respects skill, discipline, and craft. Stevens's competence is real. The tragedy begins when professionalism becomes a substitute for conscience and connection. A third misunderstanding is that Lord Darlington's failure makes Stevens innocent because he was only serving. The novel is more demanding than that. It asks what happens when people place loyalty above judgment, then claim they were too small to be responsible. The strongest scene, chapter, or idea? The strongest scene is Stevens continuing his duties while his father is dying upstairs. It contains the whole novel in compressed form. There is the great house, the international conference, the father-son wound, the professional code, the suppression of grief, and the reader's growing horror at Stevens's definition of dignity. Stevens interprets the event as proof that he belongs among the great butlers. The reader sees something else, a man who has been taught to abandon himself at the moment, when being human should matter most. That scene also prepares the reader for his failure with Miss Kenton. Stevens does not suddenly become emotionally unavailable in romance. He has already practiced the art of absence in the face of death. The book's weakest point. The novel's weakest point, depending on the reader, is that its restraint can feel too controlled. Stevens's voice is so consistent, and his evasions so meticulously shaped, that some readers may find the emotional temperature too low until the final sections. That is also the novel's method. Ishiguro risks understatement, because the story depends on the reader doing moral and emotional work beneath the narration. The book does not push grief into the reader's face. It lets Stevens hide it, then makes the hiding unbearable. A second limitation is that the political world around Lord Darlington is filtered almost entirely through Stevens's partial understanding. This is artistically right for the novel, but it means readers wanting a broad historical treatment of appeasement, fascist sympathies, and interwar diplomacy will need outside history. The book's target is not the full political map. It is the moral psychology of a man who served inside one corner of it. The tailored interpretation. The Remains of the Day is not just a novel about regret. It is a novel about what happens when someone confuses role performance with life performance. Stevens is excellent at the measurable parts of his world. He can organize staff, manage a household, anticipate needs, preserve standards, and remain composed under pressure. By the metrics of his profession, he is successful. But the unmeasured parts destroy him. He cannot measure the cost of not speaking. He cannot audit the moral value of loyalty. He cannot calculate the life not lived with Miss Kenton. He cannot produce a report showing the difference between serving greatness and serving status. That is why the novel still cuts. Many people do not ruin their lives through dramatic vice. They ruin them by becoming extremely good at the wrong scoreboard. Why this book still matters. The Remains of the Day still matters because the modern world has not escaped Stevens's mistake. It has only changed the uniform. People still hide behind roles, institutions, brands, ideologies, employers, families, and professional codes. They still say they were just doing their job. They still mistake proximity to power for purpose. They still avoid difficult emotional speech by becoming busy, useful, impressive, or controlled. The book also matters because it treats regret without cheap consolation. It does not say every missed chance returns. It does not pretend that late recognition fixes early cowardice. It gives the reader something harder: the demand to notice evasion while there is still time to act. The Nobel Prize press release for Ishiguro praised his novels for uncovering the abyss beneath our sense of connection with the world. That description fits The Remains of the Day exactly. Its surface is polished, but underneath is a life slowly discovering the emptiness beneath its own certainties. If you only remember 3 ideas, dignity without judgment becomes obedience. Stevens believes dignity means composure, but the novel shows that composure is not enough. If a person stays calm while serving a bad cause, calmness becomes complicity. Emotional restraint can be a form of fear. Stevens does feel love, grief, and shame. His tragedy is that he has trained himself to treat those feelings as unprofessional. He does not lack a heart. He lacks permission to use it. A life can be lost through small evasions. No single missed sentence destroys Stevens. The damage accumulates through repeated withdrawals, not challenging Lord Darlington, not comforting his father, not answering Miss Kenton, not admitting doubt until too late. The sentence that explains the book. The Remains of the Day is the story of a man who gave his whole life to being useful, then discovered that usefulness had not protected him from moral failure, loneliness, or regret. The real-life test. The real-life test of The Remains of the Day is simple. Where are you using duty, professionalism, loyalty, or restraint to avoid a decision that belongs to you? At work, that might mean hiding behind process when judgment is required. In relationships, it might mean staying calm instead of being honest. In family life, it might mean performing responsibility while withholding affection. In politics or institutions, it might mean obeying authority while refusing to ask what that authority is doing. The Stevens test is not whether you are disciplined. Stevens is disciplined. It is whether your discipline serves truth, courage, and care, or whether it helps you avoid them. 5 questions to test whether you understood the book. Why does Stevens define dignity through restraint? And what does that definition allow him to avoid? How does Miss Kenton expose truths that Stevens cannot admit directly? Why is Lord Darlington's political failure also Stevens' moral crisis? What does the novel suggest about class, service, and personal responsibility? Is Stevens' final decision to focus on bantering a hopeful adaptation, a tragic retreat, or both? The final lesson. The final lesson of The Remains of the Day is that a life cannot be judged only by how well it was performed. Stevens performs beautifully. That is the horror. He keeps the house running, protects the atmosphere, serves the guests, honors the hierarchy, and maintains the mask. Yet the mask becomes so perfect that the man beneath it almost disappears. Ishiguro's warning is not loud. It is colder than that. You can be loyal, skilled, polite, disciplined, and admired, and still wake up near the end of the day with the terrible knowledge that you gave your best years to the wrong master, the wrong silence, and the wrong idea of dignity.